Do you think consciousness is a way for the universe to experience itself? Hell yeah, of course. You are, you literally, your body, your brain, you are literally a way the universe itself comes alive. You are literally a fragment of the universe coming alive, experiencing what it's like to be part of the universe. That's incredible. That's remarkable, you know. What specifically is consciousness in the brain? So consciousness is going to be the sum total of the bioelectrical processes, right? People forget that your experience of the world is bioelectrical. Right now, throughout your entire body, there is a voltage. There are voltages of electricity. There are ion channels where electricity passes through. It's electrochemical. It's not the same thing as a wire, like a copper wire. But it's still a form of electricity that's flowing through your body. That's what makes you alive. That's how you experience. So your experience of red or your experience of blue is a bioelectrical experience. That's how you are alive. It's remarkable. And that's what consciousness is. It's that electricity. Is electricity on its own conscious? Well, again, there are different forms of electricity, right? The way our body produces it is electrochemically, right? In other words, there are a series of chemical reactions that give rise, that exchange ions and exchange electricity voltage. That's what moves your body. That's what moves your muscles. Right? Throughout my blood, throughout my cells, there are these exchanges of ions. Same thing with my brain, but on a very much larger scale. My brain is full of trillions of synapses, and that means there are trillions of chemical reactions happening in my brain every second. It's remarkable. That's what makes you alive. And it's remarkable that you and every one of you guys, every person, every animal, every tree, every living being on Earth is made of the same blueprint, the same DNA, for the most part. And the same processes of replication, metabolism. It's all bioelectric. Remarkable. I guess the question is, why is biometric stuff conscious? Bioelectric? That is consciousness, right? Again, your experience is the bioelectricity flowing through your body. That's how you literally experience the world. That's literally how you experience. You're experiencing through that electricity. And so it's not that this electricity gives rise to consciousness. No, it directly is consciousness. That is what it is. At least that's what the data is pointing to. We don't have a necessary consensus on this, right? I'm not saying that we know this for sure, but my suspicion, based on the evidence, is that consciousness is the process itself, and we are just the way the process comes about. Didn't you have an account with like 1 million? Yeah, I have a second account with 630,000 followers. I make my science videos on that channel. This one I do my lives on because I got banned on the other one. Yeah, it's fascinating. Science, and the greatest part about science is that it's not this like astrology bogus nonsense. It's real. Like like learning about space and time and black holes, that's real. Like those things really exist. We can measure them. So that's the beauty of science. It's actually real. I don't have to I can get that same wonder and awe from reality that, in fact, I would argue I can get even more of that from reality than astrology or religion, right? I would argue religion gives you a distorted surface level perspective on that. But science goes very deep. Science can go very deep in describing the interconnectedness between everything. Is there color in space or just jet black? Color isn't real. This is another fascinating fact about the world. When you see things that are red or black or red or blue or green, that's not really. Objects don't actually have colors. That's your brain. That's your brain's perception of those things. Color comes from the brain, the visual cortex. So when you look at something that's, for example, blue, what's happening is that light in the blue spectrum is going into your eye, and it's being perceived by photoreceptors in the eye, and in the eye, the photoreceptors are sending signals to the back of your brain. And the back of your brain, the visual cortex, that's where the color blue is being produced because of the variations of light frequencies. In reality, nothing actually has color. It's just the case that the differences, the variations in frequencies of light. Some objects, for example, like the reason why this object is blue is because the blue pigmentation in the cardboard is being reflected off of the box. Light coming from the sun and from the light bulb in my room is hitting the box, and the blue light is being reflected. The other forms of light are being absorbed by the box. The reds, the greens, the yellows, that's all being absorbed. But the other color, the blue, is the one that's more reflective. The frequencies that give rise to the blue. And so those are the frequencies that go to your eye, and then your eye receptors produce the signals that get translated into the brain that give rise to that blue color. And this goes for every object you see. Very fascinating. What does the future of evolution look like? Will new species emerge? Yes, new species always emerge. Speciation is always going on. It's always happening, right? As long as you're alive and giving rise to other, if you're giving birth, you're going to give rise to a different type of being with different DNA. Every child you have has different DNA than you. But enough time, enough generations of this, you'll get a very different species. The problem is that in humans, natural selection no longer is occurring in us. We are no longer subjected to nature. We now have phones, cars, TVs, so our evolution is going to look different than other species. Now, another problem is that with the advent of AI and robotics, we're going to leave our biological shells. We're not going to be biological for long, because robotics is far more advanced than what our bodies can do. Right? Machine life can be far more intricate, far more elaborate, far more complex than we can. Do you think the ancient life on Mars thing is real? That's a very good question. So, yes, there's a good chance life existed on Mars in the past, and there's tons of evidence for this. Firstly, we know that Mars used to be covered in water, liquid water on the surface. In fact, it had an ocean. If you melted all the ice on Mars, you would get an ocean about 4 or 5 feet deep, covering the entirety of Mars' surface. So there's a lot of water on Mars today. In fact, if you go below the surface, not only is there a subterranean ice sheet and layer, but there's a deep aquifer. There are deep aquifers that are about 7 miles deep on Mars, in which there is liquid water today. It's just that the warmth of the soil allows it to be liquid. And that's where microbes could be still living today. Microbes may still be alive on Mars, deep underground. Now, the reason why they suspected life is on life used to be on Mars on the surface is because they looked at certain sandstones near a crater on Mars where water used to flow into. It was a river channel, and they found they were looking at the rock. The rover was looking at the rock at the very edge of this river channel, and they found that there are certain ingredients in the rocks that interact with water and life. In other words, there are certain microbes on Earth we know of that produce these particular chemicals. And there's a chemical reaction that makes these stones, they're crystals, but whatever. The point is that the only way we know of on Earth that makes these crystals is life. Microbes make these crystals. And on Mars, we found those same crystals near a river channel. So this is remarkable evidence, and there are natural ways in which these crystals can form, but it's highly unlikely to be natural because the temperatures that would be required to make that from just the mere geology would be too high. You would need way higher temperatures, and there's no evidence of higher temperatures there. It was a cold place, maybe 30, 40 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius. And so the natural processes could not have possibly made those crystals. It must have been microbial life. And so there's a very good chance that life was on Mars, which would change if we found direct evidence. We don't know for sure yet. The only way we can know for sure is if we bring those samples back to Earth. Then we can more confidently say yes. But if we do, if we find life on Mars in any capacity, it would change our understanding of biology. It would change what it means to be living. It would change our understanding of aliens. It'd be one of the most amazing discoveries ever. Is it possible to terraform Mars? Yes. The only way you do that is by heating it up. Okay, Mars is cold right now. It's very cold, like negative 200 degrees Celsius. The only way to heat it up is to melt the surface and unleash CO2 and other gases that go into the atmosphere and create a greenhouse effect. You have to melt the ice. That would create water vapor. That would induce even more warmth to the surface. And so you would kind of need a lengthy process of this, heating the surface along with greenhouse effect and a feedback loop of warmth. It would take a couple centuries to make that happen. It's possible, but it would take a long time, given current technology. Another problem is you need lots of oxygen, and the only way you can make that in high amounts is through microbial life. That's where most of our oxygen comes from. Farts of bacteria. We are literally breathing the farts of bacteria. But if you introduce those bacteria to the Martian surface, it will fertilize the soil and also give rise to oxygen in very low amounts. Again, that would take a long time to create the same degree of oxygen we have on Earth. The last important feature you need is a magnetic field. Mars doesn't have a magnetic field. It's a very weak one, at best. And so there's lots of cosmic radiation that bombards the surface and is dangerous for life. That's why life doesn't really exist on the surface. But the way you can make a magnetic field is by creating something called a plasma torus, in which you land a nuclear facility on one of the Martian moons, which orbits Mars, and you create from the moon dust, you create charged particles, that a lot of them that get spit out from the moon, and as the moon orbits around the Mars, you'll find a stream of charged particles that collectively become an artificial magnetic field. Because that's really what a magnetic field is. It's just the movement and motion of charged particles in a torus. And so, if you can make that, you could potentially have a magnetic field on Mars. So there are ways to do it. There are many ways to do it. It's just going to be hard with current technology. It would take a long time. Did you hear Saturn is losing its rings? Well, Saturn's rings will grow and die throughout. They've grown and died throughout time, right? There's always going to be the formation of rocks around Saturn. That's what it's comprised of, dust and rocks, and so that's the rings. Yeah, eventually it'll be lost completely, but there is always going to be some kind of remnant of rings. No, we're not colorblind. The point is that color isn't a real feature of the universe externally. That's its internal reality, right? So color is real in our brains, but it's not real to objects. In other words, the reason why you see things is not because of your eyes alone. It's your brain. Your brain is what generates what you see. Think about that. See, your eyes merely send the signals to your brain, but the brain is what makes you see and hear. Your ears don't hear. They're just flesh. What makes you hear are the signals from the outside world going into your ears, your eardrums. The signals stimulate neurons in the ear, and then those neurons create signals that are easily translated into the auditory cortex of the brain. And so what you're hearing is your brain. Every noise you hear is coming from your brain, not your ears. Same with your eyes. The same with every one of your senses. Your nose. Your smell comes from your brain, your olfactory in the brain. There are certain chemicals in the air. They go into the nose. Your nose filters certain chemicals based on their sizes and shapes. And those molecules stimulate those neurons in the nose, up the nose, and then they send signals to the olfactory in the brain. And that gives rise to your smell. Okay, so every sense you have comes from the brain. Every sense, touching, right? Every time you touch something, what's happening is those pain receptors in your skin, very close to your skin, they're being stimulated by movement. But those signals throughout your body send that signal to your brain. And your brain is what's giving you the sense of feeling, of touch. And so your brain is your nervous system. That's where everything you feel and experience comes from. Would I ever want to travel at light speed? The funny thing is we are. If you understand Einstein's relativity, you realize that everything in the universe is actually traveling at the speed of light, including you. It's just that most of your motion is in the temporal dimension. Most of your motion is in the temporal dimension, not spatial dimensions, right? So there's 4 dimensions. There's time and 3 is space. We're not moving much in space through space. I mean, we're on the Earth, moving through the sun, but that's a very small portion of your speed. Most of your speed is going in the temporal dimension. So we are all nearly moving through time at the speed of light. Do you think the ancient Martians looked like humans? There was probably no complex life on Mars. The reason why is because, unlike the Earth, Mars had very little time to yield complex life. Mars is smaller than the Earth. It's about 30% smaller. And so, because of its small size, it has a very weak gravity, and this allows the atmosphere to be stripped away very easily, as well as the fact that it lacked a magnetic field for most of its life. The magnetic field quickly went cool. Its internal core quickly cooled down. The Earth, thankfully, has enough material in its core, and it's large enough to sustain a magnetic field for 4.5 billion years. But on Mars, its magnetic field died out probably 3 billion years ago. And so, if Mars had life on its surface, it was probably only given maybe 1 billion years at best to evolve. And if you know anything about Earth life, it took Earth life to go from bacteria to multicelled organisms. It took about 4 billion years for that to happen. Give or take a few hundred million years. Let's say 3 billion years. It took 3 billion years to go from bacteria to multicelled organisms, right? The first multicelled organisms emerged about 1 billion years ago on Earth. So for the most of Earth's history, you couldn't see life visibly. It would just be bacteria. It'd be microscopic, right? And the first animals didn't appear in the oceans until about 600 million years ago. Think about that. Or, let's say 700 million years ago, right? Think about that. It took a lot of time for life on Earth to become complex. But on Mars, it wasn't given that time that it needed. And so it's possible that if Mars was a bit bigger, there might be life there. But unfortunately, it's not big. And so its atmosphere slowly got stripped away, its water slowly evaporated and sunk to the subterranean. Its magnetic field slowly died. It got cold. So that's a sign to... That's a reminder of how precious life is, how precious Earth is. We are rare. We should cherish that and celebrate that. We should not take it for granted. Do you often think how lucky we are to be complex life on a planet that sustains life? Absolutely. Every day I'm extremely grateful to be here. Every day. Every day is a gift. What if there's life on the underground waters of Mars and it got time to evolve? That's a great point. How about the life underground? Well, the problem is that it'd be very low energy. So the reason why life on Earth got so complex is because there was lots of energy. The sun was able to peer onto the surface and fuel plants, and plant life fueled animal life. And so it fueled the complexity. The sun is the reason why we're so complex. But the Martian microbes, because they're so underground, they don't rely on the sun, right? They rely on chemical energy. They might degrade some rocks and get their energy from that. And so they're very limited in the complexity that they could obtain. It's highly unlikely that they're going to be any more complex than basic multicellular organisms. Because if you think about it, life on Earth only became complex because it needed to. There were evolutionary reasons for it. Right? There were predation, there was prey, there was an open ocean in which eyesight could help you survive, finding food, escaping predators. But in Mars, there's no evolutionary pressure for that to happen. There isn't an open ocean, there isn't light. And so the life down there is probably very limited because of the lack of energy. But good point. But learning about Mars, learning about other planets, reminds you of how incredible we have it here on Earth. They give you a lesson. They teach you a lesson about how incredible life is on Earth. You think about how many things had to happen for us to get here, the way we are. It's remarkable, and it really makes you appreciate what you are. It does. The Big Bang Theory isn't proven, and abiogenesis is just a theory. So, the Big Bang, although a theory, does not mean a guess. Okay, in science, a theory is not a mere guess. A theory is an explanation for a fact. It's a model of reality. And so the Big Bang actually happened. We can measure it. We can measure the radiation that's remnant of the Big Bang. We can see it all around us. In fact, there is radiation from the Big Bang moving throughout your body as we speak. It's in microwave form. Okay, it's very low energy light, but it's moving throughout your entire body. It's moving throughout the Earth. It's moving throughout the entire universe. And that is evidence of the Big Bang, that something drastic happened 14 billion years ago to create that kind of energy. And because we find this all over the universe, it means that at one point it was in higher energy form. As it moved throughout the universe, it lost energy as the universe expanded. But it signifies that before time, but 14 billion years ago, it was in at least X-ray or perhaps even gamma ray form, and it was extremely energy dense. And that required a vastly powerful event to occur. And so that's evidence, that's key evidence of the Big Bang. Another evidence of the Big Bang is you can do physics on that event, right? If you calculate the energy densities of these things, you can do physics and math and recognize the types of material that might come about from these processes. This is called Big Bang nucleosynthesis. Okay. In other words, we look at the universe and we find certain abundance ratios of elements. There are certain abundances of elements like hydrogen and helium and carbon. And when we do a basic look on the universe, we find that at the Big Bang, there would have been certain ratios of elements that would have been produced. And we find exactly those ratios of elements that were produced during the Big Bang. That's startling evidence. That's remarkable evidence to solidify the Big Bang. There's also primordial clouds we find. We find that during the Big Bang, if we do physics, you go, yeah, there would be these big clouds of hydrogen in the universe. We go out there, we peer into the deeper universe, and we see those clouds. We see primordial gas clouds that are full of hydrogen and helium. And no stars. They didn't have enough time to form stars, right? The point is that we can look back through time by looking into space, because it takes time for light to get to us. Light doesn't travel instantly, right? There's a finite speed to light. And so because it has a finite speed, you look back in space, you're looking back in time. And so we can look at the very first galaxies, the very first stars that formed, and we can see a cosmic evolution, a sequence of cosmic events that we see going back in the past. We find a very simplistic universe with very little stars, very little galaxies, and now we find a universe full of complex structures. And that's another key evidence of the Big Bang. And so again, saying that, brushing off the Big Bang as just a theory is a complete misunderstanding of what theory means in science. Theories are based on evidence and data and tons of research. Okay. Another thing you said was abiogenesis. Now that is a hypothesis. We don't have enough evidence yet to suggest that that is exactly how it happened. We have enough evidence to say this is probably what happened. It could be what happened. Okay. But we don't have enough evidence to say that this is likely what happened. We don't have the exact formula, the exact sequence of chemical events that allowed life to form, but we have a general idea of it. We still have enough data to say, yeah, this is probably what this could have happened. This could have been what happened. And we can build, for example, protocells in labs. We can build vesicles out of basic lipid molecules. You introduce a lipid bilayer to water, it forms a spherical structure randomly, spontaneously. Okay, this is a key sign that, lipid molecules in the ocean will form a protocell. We can look at amylase structures. These are kinds of proteins that they elongate over time. They build upon themselves. They form sheets, and those sheets can break. And the ends of those sheets that broke, they can actually form new amino acids. They can catalyze their own reactants to make new products. This is a key sign that early forms of metabolism were likely coming from those simple amino acids. And where do amino acids come from? Well, amino acids come from gases from the atmosphere. Ammonia and methane and other kinds of gases can produce amino acids with the addition of some electricity and heat. So near volcanic vents undersea, you can find energy, and you find those gases. You find ammonia in the waters, and that's where they can form. Lipid molecules and amino acids, they can form in the ocean, they can form in the atmosphere, and you get a mixing of these things. You get a circulation of these ingredients. You get a chemical evolution, and you get life over time. We don't have the full puzzle piece. We don't have the full puzzle completed, but we have enough to say, yeah, this is what could have happened. Okay, hope that answers your question. Mike, explain string theory for the beginners. I don't know much about it, but I will... Yeah, I'm not an expert on string theory, but all I'll say is that the standard idea is that you have an atom, right? We're made of molecules. Okay, what's smaller than a molecule? Atoms. Atoms make up molecules. Okay, what's in an atom? You have a nucleus, you have protons and neutrons. Okay, well, what's smaller than that? Right, what's in the nucleus? Well, you have protons and neutrons. What's in those? Well, gluons. Right? Well, what's in that? Well, that's where conventional ideas stop. That's where standard physics stops and says nothing. But string theory goes a step beyond that and says, maybe the smallest particle is assigned, and all small particles are assigned strings, vibrations in a lower dimension. there's a lower dimension, or either one-dimensional or two-dimensional strings or shapes that give rise, the vibrations of those strings give rise to their corresponding particles. And so an electron might have a certain string vibration, okay? A proton might have its own vibration of a string, okay? And the point is that there are different dimensions. There might be higher dimensions or lower dimensions beyond our four that these particles come from. That's like the most basic way I can say it. That's all I know. I'll leave it there. Is there other planets that potentially could have life? Absolutely. Absolutely. The estimates for the number of planets in our galaxy are trillions. There are trillions of planets in our galaxy. And if you do the basic math on this, you find that given the number of planets in our galaxy, even if 1% of them are like Earth, or at least in the habitable zone, you know, the size of the Earth and the kind of rough temperature, that's about 1 billion planets like Earth in our galaxy that could have life. And so even if 1% of those are very similar to the Earth's conditions, well, that's millions of possible examples of life in our galaxy. Millions. And there are billions of galaxies. There could be countless life forms out there with varying degrees of complexities. In fact, there might be aliens out there that are smarter than us, far smarter than us. Yeah, every star you see, roughly every star you see in the Milky Way galaxy has a planet around it, at least one or two. You believe trans women are women, yet you're here talking about galaxies. Well, you are part of the galaxy. It's related to you. We all are. We are all part of the galaxy. Each and every one of us. We're all connected. This guy thinks our DNA formed randomly. That's mathematically impossible. It's not. See, when people say it's mathematically impossible that DNA formed, they are assuming that it's formed in one step. That it went from no DNA to DNA in one step. Well, that's not at all. That's a caricature of the reality. In reality, there would be a vast chemical evolution. There are steps. There's a step-by-step process that happen naturally. One of the steps is RNA. And so it's not just that, you know, a couple molecules randomly, spontaneously happen to form DNA. No, we're talking about a sequence of events, of precursors, right? There are precursors to DNA, RNA for one. There could be other forms of, there could be even more earlier precursors to RNA, that we just haven't understood yet. But the point is that there is a sequence of steps that made DNA. And so the chance of that happening will be 100% because you're going to get enough chemical evolution to get to the next step. Getting to the next step is far simpler and easier and likely than getting from the first step to the top in one. Does that make sense? For example, what you're saying is getting from the bottom step to the top step is impossible. I agree. Getting from the bottom to the top in one step is very unlikely. But if you take the stairs step by step, well, then you see how it's very likely to get to the top. You're forgetting all those steps. sharing DNA with animals doesn't mean we come from them. We don't come from animals. We are animals. We are apes. And the fact that we do have DNA in common with them is a sign that we share common descent. Why? Because we find not just DNA, but fossils. We find phenotypical similarities and homologies. We find tons of evidence that we share common descent. And so to dismiss this and say, no, well, just because they're common doesn't mean that we're animals. That's a complete misunderstanding of the biology. If you're religious and wrong, nothing happens. If you're right, then you get to enjoy paradise. Who said that? Who said you get to enjoy paradise? And what do you mean by paradise? To you, paradise is getting down on your knees and praying to God forever. To me, that's hell. Who said that your paradise is the paradise? And who said that your religion is the only religion that can be correct? What if the other thousands of religions are correct? What if, what if the religion of Dr. Doom is correct, and if you believe in that religion, you go to hell? How do you know that one's not correct? So you're not in any better position than me. You just happen to believe in one more than me, but it doesn't mean you're correct. It doesn't mean that you're likely to be correct. It's a false dichotomy. You can cancel out most religions that aren't popular. They're less likely to be true. So you're saying that the more popular it is, the more likely it is to be true? This is a clear ad populum fallacy. Right? Just because something's popular doesn't make it true. By the way, flat eartherism was very popular before we found the earth, before we found out the earth was round. Popularity does not get to truth. So, it's a shame everything is so far away. Reminds me of a fantastic quote by Stephen Hawking. Let me preface it for... So, Stephen Hawking, if you guys aren't familiar with him, he was a scientist who was an astrophysicist who all his life studied black holes and stars. When he was in his early 20s, however, he succumbed to ALS. He succumbed to a disease in which he was paralyzed. His whole body was paralyzed. And so he lived the rest of his life in a wheelchair, only being able to speak through a computer. However, he didn't stop learning and discovering things about black holes. In fact, most of what we know about black holes comes from Stephen Hawking. He never stopped. And so, in fact, he was closest to the stars than anybody on Earth who was not in a wheelchair was. Because he said, in his own words, although I cannot move and I have to speak through a computer, in my mind, I'm free. Through your mind, you can understand the universe. You can be as close as you want to a black hole. Stephen Hawking understood black holes from his wheelchair because in his mind he was free. He used his mind to understand the true nature of reality. So, on that note, I hope you enjoyed. Hope you opened your mind a little bit here. And see you next time.